The thermometer read 45 degrees below zero, and Catherine Dvorak's chimney barely smoked, while her neighbors' cabins poured thick columns into the January sky, their occupants desperately feeding fires that couldn't keep the cold at bay. What happened in the 18 months before that morning would change how the few who listened built their shelters across the northern frontier, though most would dismiss her discovery as the mad project of a grief-stricken widow until the winter proved them catastrophically wrong. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode reveals an invention even more unbelievable than this one. Henryk Dvorak left the cabin at dawn on January 14, 1853, wearing every piece of wool clothing he owned. The temperature had dropped throughout the night, and Catherine watched frost spread across the inside of their window, thick enough to obscure the gray light filtering through. Her husband moved stiffly, his breath creating clouds that hung in the air even inside their home. The fire in the hearth burned hot, consuming logs at an alarming rate, yet cold emanated from the corners of their rectangular cabin like water seeping through cloth. They had arrived in Montana Territory 8 months earlier, part of a small wave of settlers drawn by reports of fertile valleys and abundant game. Henryk had built their cabin in 4 days that previous summer, following the standard method every frontiersman knew. He had notched pine logs at the corners, stacked them 8 feet high, chinked the gaps with moss and mud, and covered the structure with a simple, gabled roof. The cabin measured 16 feet by 20 feet, with a door on the south wall and one small window on the east. It had seemed adequate during autumn. Winter revealed its failures with brutal efficiency. Catherine stood near the fireplace, the only genuinely warm spot in the entire structure. 5 feet away, the temperature dropped noticeably. In the corners, frost accumulated on the inside walls despite the roaring fire. The door, made from split planks, had shrunk in the dry cold, creating gaps that whistled with wind. The window, covered with oiled paper, provided minimal insulation. Most critically, the notched corners where logs joined leaked heat continuously. Cold air found every imperfection in the chinking and flowed inside like an invisible flood. Henryk was checking their trap lines, a routine he performed every 3rd day. The traps were spread along a creek 2 miles from the camp, positioned to catch beaver and marten. The work required several hours of walking through deep snow, checking each trap, resetting those that had been triggered, and collecting any animals caught. It was dangerous work in extreme cold, but necessary. The furs they collected represented their only income, their only means of purchasing supplies when they made the long journey to the trading post. Catherine watched him wrap a wool scarf across his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. He picked up his rifle, checked that his powder horn was secure, and pushed open the door. Cold air rushed inside with physical force, extinguishing the candle on the table and sending smoke billowing backward from the fireplace. Henryk stepped out quickly and pulled the door shut behind him. Catherine moved to the window and scraped frost away with her fingernail, watching her husband's dark figure move across the white landscape until he disappeared into the tree line to the north. She turned back to the fire and added 2 more logs. The flames consumed wood faster in extreme cold, as if the fire itself was fighting a losing battle against the temperature. She calculated mentally. They had enough firewood stacked outside to last perhaps 3 more weeks if the cold continued at this intensity. After that, Henryk would need to cut more, a dangerous proposition in deep winter. She pulled a chair close to the hearth and sat down to wait, knowing he would return by midday cold and exhausted, needing hot food and warm shelter that their cabin barely provided. Catherine expected Henryk by early afternoon. When the sun reached its peak and began its descent toward the western mountains, she felt the first stirring of concern. By mid-afternoon, concern became worry. She stood at the window repeatedly, scraping away frost that reformed within minutes, searching the white landscape for any sign of movement. The creek where Henryk checked traps lay 2 miles north, following a path they had marked with blazes on trees during autumn. In good weather, the round trip required 4 hours. In deep cold with snow, perhaps 6. It was now approaching 7 hours since his departure. The fire demanded constant attention. Catherine added logs every 30 minutes, maintaining flames that provided warmth only within a 5-foot radius. Beyond that small circle, the cabin remained brutally cold. She wore 2 wool dresses, a heavy coat, thick stockings, and fur-lined boots, yet still felt cold in the corners and near the walls. The structure they lived in was fundamentally inadequate for Montana winter, a fact that became more obvious with each passing hour. She prepared soup using dried venison, potatoes, and the last of their onions. The pot hung over the fire, and the smell of cooking meat filled the cabin. She kept the soup warm, expecting Henrik to arrive hungry and half-frozen. The afternoon light faded earlier in January, and by 4 o'clock dusk had settled across the valley. Catherine lit 2 candles, precious resources they tried to conserve, but she wanted Henrik to see light in the window if he was returning in darkness. By 5 o'clock, full darkness had arrived, and Henrik had not returned. Catherine stood at the door, listening for any sound that might indicate his approach. The night was silent, except for wind, moving through pine trees and the occasional crack of wood, splitting in extreme cold. She knew with certainty now that something had gone wrong. Henrik was competent and careful, not a man who took unnecessary risks. If he had not returned by now, he was either injured or dead. She faced an impossible choice. Going to search for him in darkness and extreme cold was dangerous, potentially fatal. She had no experience navigating by moonlight through snow-covered forest. She could easily become lost, exhaust herself, and freeze. But staying in the cabin meant abandoning Henrik if he was injured and needed help. She stood at the door for 10 minutes, hand on the latch, trying to decide. Finally, practical reality made the decision for her. She had no idea where along the trapline Henrik might be. The route covered 2 miles of creek with traps set at irregular intervals. Searching in darkness would be futile and suicidal. If Henrik was injured and conscious, he would seek shelter and wait for daylight. If he was unconscious or dead, she could not help him regardless. She had to wait for morning. Catherine spent that night feeding the fire and sitting in her chair, unable to sleep. Every sound outside brought her to the window, hoping to see Henrik's shape approaching through the darkness. Dawn came at 7:30, gray and cold. Henrik had been gone 24 hours. Catherine left at first light, carrying Henrik's spare rifle and following the marked trail north. The temperature had dropped further overnight, and her breath crystallized instantly in the air. The snow crunched under her boots with a sound like breaking glass, indicating extreme cold. She moved as quickly as she dared, knowing that every minute outside increased her risk, but driven by desperate hope that Henrik might still be alive. She found him 1.5 miles from the cabin, near the 4th trap location along the creek. He lay in the snow beside a partially frozen beaver pond, his rifle a few feet away. Catherine knew immediately he was dead. His body was frozen solid, positioned awkwardly, one arm extended as if reaching for something. Snow had drifted partially over him during the night. She approached slowly, her mind strangely calm, despite the horror of what she was seeing. The story was clear in the snow around his body. Henrik had been checking the trap when something had gone wrong. There were signs of a struggle, disturbed snow in a wide area, and what looked like blood-frozen black against the white ground. A beaver trap chain had been pulled from its anchor. Catherine pieced together what must have happened. Henrik had found a large beaver in the trap, and had attempted to dispatch and retrieve it. Somehow, perhaps the beaver had fought harder than expected, or perhaps Henrik had slipped on ice, but he had ended up in the creek. His clothing was frozen stiff, confirming he had been submerged. In 40-degree below zero weather, wet clothing meant death within minutes. Henrik had managed to pull himself from the water, but he had already been hypothermic. He had tried to return to the cabin, had made it perhaps 50 yards from the creek, and had collapsed. The cold had killed him quickly after that, probably within 10 minutes. He had died alone, unable to call for help, unable to start a fire with frozen hands, unable to do anything but lie down in the snow and lose consciousness. Catherine stood over her husband's body for several minutes. She felt grief, but it was distant, wrapped in layers of shock and cold. The immediate problem was practical. She could not move Henrik alone. His frozen body would weigh close to 200 pounds, and dragging it through deep snow for a mile and a half was impossible. She would need help from the nearest neighbors, the Patterson family, who lived 3 miles to the east. She marked the location by tying her scarf to a nearby tree branch, then turned and walked back to the cabin. The return journey took 30 minutes. Once inside, she built up the fire and spent 20 minutes warming herself, knowing that traveling another 3 miles to the Patterson cabin required she not be already exhausted and cold. Then she set out again, this time heading east along the crude trail that connected the scattered homesteads in the valley. Samuel Patterson and his 2 grown sons returned with Catherine that afternoon. They brought a sled and retrieved Henrik's frozen body, loading it carefully and transporting it back to the Dvorak cabin. The men were respectful and quiet, understanding the horror of what had happened. They had all lost people to the frontier, and they recognized that Henrik's death, while tragic, was not unusual. Men died in winter with brutal regularity, victims of accidents, cold, wildlife, or simple bad luck. They helped Catherine dig a grave the next morning, chopping through frozen ground with pickaxes for 3 hours until they had excavated a hole deep enough. They buried Henrik on a small rise 50 yards from the cabin, marking the grave with a wooden cross Samuel Patterson constructed from split planks. Catherine stood during the brief burial, dry-eyed and silent. The Patterson men left before noon, offering their condolences and assistance if she needed anything. Then Catherine was alone. She spent the first 3 days after Henrik's burial simply maintaining survival. She fed the fire constantly, ate sparingly from their dwindling supplies, and tried to keep herself from freezing in the inadequate cabin. But by the 4th day, something had shifted in her mind. The grief was still present, but it had transformed into something else. Anger. Not anger at Henrik or at fate, but anger at the stupidity of their situation. Her husband had died because he got wet in extreme cold, but the reason he had been out in extreme cold for so long was because their cabin could not hold heat. If their shelter had been warmer, perhaps Henrik would have noticed the temperature dropping and returned earlier. If their cabin had been properly built, perhaps she could have accompanied him, providing a second person who might have prevented the accident. Catherine began studying her cabin with new attention. She spent hours examining how it failed. The corners were the worst problem. Where the logs notched together, gaps opened despite chinking. She could feel cold air flowing through these gaps, a constant stream of freezing wind that no amount of mud or moss could stop. The notched joint itself created a thermal bridge, a pathway for heat to escape. The rectangular shape meant 4 corners, 4 major failure points. She observed how the interior temperature varied dramatically. Near the fire, it was tolerable, perhaps 50 degrees. 10 feet away, it dropped to near freezing. In the corners, frost formed on the inside walls continuously. The geometry of the rectangular cabin created pockets where cold air pooled and circulated. Heat rose to the peak of the gabled roof and escaped through imperfect construction at the ridgeline. The floor, just packed earth, absorbed cold from the frozen ground below and radiated it upward. Catherine started keeping notes, something that helped organize her thoughts. She wrote down observations, measurements, and questions. How much firewood did she consume per day? Approximately 16 logs. How warm was the cabin 10 feet from the fire? She estimated 35 degrees. How much warmer could it be, theoretically? She had no answer, but knew it should be better. She began to understand that Henrik had not died simply because of an accident. He had died because they lived in a shelter that required them to venture into extreme cold regularly just to gather enough firewood to survive. And that forced exposure eventually killed people. The isolation of deep winter gave Catherine time to think without interruption. She maintained her survival routine, managing the fire, rationing food, melting snow for water, but her mind worked constantly on the problem of shelter and heat. She found herself remembering her childhood in Bohemia, a region of mountains and cold winters not unlike Montana. Her family had been poor farmers, living in a stone cottage that stayed remarkably warm despite limited firewood. She had not thought about that cottage in years, but now she recalled specific details. The walls had been thick, perhaps 18 inches of stone and mortar. The cottage had been small, and she remembered her father explaining that smaller spaces were easier to heat. But there was something else, something about the shape. Some of the older buildings in the mountain villages had been different from the square cottages most people built. She remembered a shepherd's hut high in the summer pastures, a structure her father had pointed out when she was perhaps 8 years old. That hut had been round, built from stacked stone in a circular pattern with a conical roof. Her father had said it was an old design, very old, and that it stayed warm in the worst storms because it had no corners for wind to catch. Catherine had not understood what he meant at the time. Now, sitting in her freezing rectangular cabin, with cold pouring through the corners, the memory suddenly made perfect sense. Corners were weak points structurally and thermally. A round building had no corners. Wind could not catch and tear at joints because there were no joints to exploit. Heat could not pool and escape through corner gaps because there were no corners. It was simple geometry, but the implications were profound. She thought about indigenous peoples she had encountered during the journey west. Some tribes used circular lodges, structures covered with hides or bark that seemed flimsy but apparently functioned adequately. The white settlers she knew dismissed these as primitive, inferior to proper rectangular log cabins. But Catherine began questioning that assumption. If indigenous peoples who had lived in this climate for generations used circular structures, perhaps they understood something white settlers had ignored. She had no formal education in mathematics or engineering, but she understood basic concepts. A circle distributed force evenly around its perimeter, a rectangle concentrated force at corners. A circle had the smallest perimeter for a given area, meaning less wall surface to lose heat through. A circle created a natural central point, ideal for a fireplace that would radiate heat evenly in all directions. Every practical advantage seemed to favor a circular design, yet she had never seen a white settler build a round cabin. Catherine spent days thinking through the challenges. How would you build a round cabin using logs? Traditional log construction used long, straight timbers notched at corners. That method would not work for a curve. You would need a different approach entirely. She thought about the cordwood she used for firewood, short logs, cut to uniform length. What if you stacked cordwood like bricks, creating a thick wall? The pieces were short enough to follow a curve. The ends could face outward, creating a solid surface. Mortar between the pieces would hold them together. The idea seemed strange, even absurd. Building walls from firewood? But the more Catherine considered it, the more sense it made. Cordwood walls would be thick, providing insulation. The short pieces would be easier to handle than long logs. Damaged sections could be repaired by replacing individual pieces rather than entire logs. And most importantly, the method would allow for circular construction, eliminating the corners that made her current cabin so miserably cold. Spring arrived slowly in Montana Territory, with snowmelt beginning in late March. Catherine had survived the winter alone, consuming nearly all their stored food and firewood. As the weather moderated, she began venturing farther from the cabin, hunting small game and gathering information. Her nearest neighbors lived miles apart, but occasional travelers passed through the valley, and Catherine made a point of speaking with anyone willing to talk about building techniques and winter survival. In early April, she encountered a Salish woman near the creek where Henrik had died. The woman was gathering early spring plants, digging roots from the thawing ground. Catherine approached cautiously, aware that relations between white settlers and indigenous peoples ranged from cooperative to hostile, depending on circumstances and individuals. The woman watched Catherine's approach without alarm, and when Catherine greeted her in halting attempts at trade language mixed with gestures, the woman responded with English better than Catherine's attempts at Salish. Her name was Mary, a designation she used when speaking with white people, though she indicated her Salish name was different. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in a mixture of traditional and trade goods, and she seemed amused rather than threatened by Catherine's presence. They talked briefly about plants and weather, the conversation polite but cautious. Then Catherine asked about winter lodges, explaining that her husband had died during the cold and that she was trying to understand how to build better shelter. Mary's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more serious. She explained that her people used several types of structures depending on season and purpose. Winter lodges were partially underground, circular, with pole frameworks covered by layers of bark, hides, and earth. The buried portion provided insulation from ground cold. The circular shape meant no corners for wind. The earth covering held heat. A central fire warmed the entire space evenly. Mary described lodges where 20 people lived comfortably through winter storms that would kill anyone exposed outside. Catherine listened intently, asking questions about construction methods and materials. Mary seemed surprised by the intensity of Catherine's interest. Most white settlers, she noted, considered indigenous building methods primitive and refused to learn from them, preferring to build rectangular cabins that performed poorly in extreme cold. Catherine asked if Mary would show her an actual winter lodge structure, and after some consideration, Mary agreed. They walked 3 miles to a seasonal camp where Mary's extended family maintained several structures. The winter lodges were partially dismantled for the season, but the frameworks remained, and Catherine could examine the construction. The lodges were indeed circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, with the floor excavated 2 feet below ground level. Poles formed a conical framework, and Catherine could see how layers of materials had been attached to create thick, insulated walls. The entrance faced east, away from prevailing winter winds. A smoke hole at the peak allowed fire smoke to escape while retaining heat. Catherine spent 2 hours examining the structures, asking questions, and taking mental notes. Mary explained design elements that white builders ignored: the importance of the partially buried floor for insulation, the value of layered walls that trapped air, the advantage of a conical roof for snow load and heat retention. Catherine absorbed every detail, her mind racing with possibilities. When she finally thanked Mary and prepared to leave, the Salish woman made an observation that Catherine would remember for years. White people, Mary said, often died in winter because they built houses for their pride instead of houses for survival. Catherine returned to her cabin with her mind full of new information. She spent the next week thinking through the problem systematically, trying to understand not just what worked, but why it worked. She had no formal education in science or mathematics, but she had practical intelligence and the ability to observe and reason. She started with basic questions and worked toward answers through logic and experimentation. Why did corners make cabins cold? She examined her own cabin's corners closely, on both interior and exterior. The notched joints created gaps that were impossible to seal completely. Wood shrank and expanded with temperature and moisture changes, and the notches allowed movement that constantly opened new gaps. Even perfectly fitted notches created thermal bridges where wood conducted cold from outside to inside. The rectangular shape meant 4 corners, 4 major points of weakness. Wind hitting a rectangular building created turbulence at corners, increased pressure, and forced cold air through any available gap. Catherine conducted a simple experiment. She placed 4 candles in her cabin, 1 in each corner, and measured how quickly they melted compared to a candle placed in the center of the room. The corner candles melted noticeably slower, indicating lower temperatures, She then held a damp cloth in various locations and timed how long it took to freeze. In corners, freezing occurred in minutes. Near the center, it took much longer. The corners were consistently 15 to 20 degrees colder than the center, a massive temperature gradient in a small space. She thought about circles. A circle had no corners, no points where walls met at angles. Every point on a circular wall was equidistant from the center. If you placed a fire at the center of a circular room, the heat would radiate outward equally in all directions. No portion of the wall would be farther from the heat source than any other portion. The geometry alone suggested superior heat distribution, but there was more. A circle was the most efficient shape in terms of perimeter versus area. A circular cabin with a given interior area had less exterior wall surface than a rectangular cabin with the same area. Less wall surface meant less area for heat to escape through. Catherine calculated roughly using string and stakes in the dirt floor, A's. Rectangular cabin measuring 16 feet by 20 feet had 320 square feet of interior area and 72 feet of perimeter wall. A circular cabin with 320 square feet of area would have a diameter of approximately 20 feet and a perimeter of approximately 63 feet. 9 feet less perimeter meant 9 feet less wall to lose heat through. The difference seemed small, but in extreme cold, every reduction in heat loss mattered. The structural advantages of circular construction also became clear through observation. Catherine had noticed that snow tended to drift against the flat walls of her rectangular cabin, sometimes piling 4 or 5 feet high. The snow weight and wind pressure stressed the walls. She imagined snow encountering a circular cabin. The curved surface would deflect wind rather than blocking it. Snow would slide around the structure rather than piling against flat surfaces. The circular shape was aerodynamic, presenting no flat face for wind to push against. She began sketching designs in a notebook using a precious piece of paper she had saved. She drew circular floor plans, calculated approximate dimensions, and planned how cordwood construction could create the curved walls she envisioned. The design that emerged was radical by frontier standards, but made perfect sense according to every principle she had discovered. By late April, Catherine had developed specific plans for a circular cordwood cabin. She needed to share these plans with neighbors, not because she required permission, but because she needed help acquiring materials and labor she could not manage alone. The Patterson family remained her closest neighbors, and Samuel Patterson had been kind following Henrik's death. Catherine walked to their homestead on a mild spring morning and asked if she could discuss her building plans. Samuel Patterson listened politely as Catherine explained her design. She described the circular layout, the cordwood wall construction, the advantages for heat retention and structural strength. She showed him her sketches and explained the reasoning behind each element. Samuel's expression grew increasingly skeptical as she talked. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment before responding carefully, clearly trying to be kind to a widow he considered grief-addled. A round cabin, he explained gently, was not practical. Rectangular cabins were built rectangular because that design worked. Logs were straight, and straight logs made straight walls. Trying to curve walls would be difficult and weak. Cordwood might work for a small shed, but not a dwelling. The structure would lack integrity. The roof would be nearly impossible to frame. Interior furniture could not be placed against curved walls efficiently. Most importantly, everyone built rectangular cabins, which meant the design was proven and sensible. Deviating from proven methods was foolish, potentially dangerous. Catherine argued her points calmly. She explained the thermal advantages, the structural benefits, the indigenous precedents. Samuel remained unconvinced. He suggested instead that Catherine allow him to help her build a proper rectangular cabin, larger and better chinked than the one she currently occupied. That would solve her heating problems adequately. Catherine thanked him for his concern, but insisted she would build according to her own design. Samuel shook his head, but promised he would help her acquire materials if she was determined to proceed with what he clearly considered a doomed project. Word spread through the sparse community quickly. The widow Dvorak was planning to build a round cabin from firewood. The response ranged from concern to mockery. Other settlers stopped by Catherine's cabin over the following weeks, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but actually to investigate whether the rumors were true. Catherine showed them her plans and explained her reasoning. Most responded similarly to Samuel Patterson. They were polite but dismissive, suggesting gently or directly that she was making a mistake born from grief and isolation. Some comments were less kind. She overheard herself referred to as the round woman and poor mad Catherine at the trading post when she went to purchase supplies. One elderly trapper told her directly that she was wasting time and money on a structure that would collapse in the first winter storm. A young homesteader offered to marry her, suggesting she needed a man to make sensible decisions about building. Catherine declined politely and continued with her preparations. The mockery stung, but it also strengthened her resolve. She had watched Henrik die because their cabin could not hold heat. She had spent a winter freezing in corners and burning wood at unsustainable rates. She had observed indigenous winter lodges that outperformed white settlers' cabins in every practical measure. She understood geometry and physics well enough to know her design was sound. The fact that no one else had built a circular cabin did not mean it was wrong. It meant only that no one else had bothered to question tradition. Catherine spent May preparing for construction with methodical precision. She had limited money, approximately $40 from selling Henrik's furs and tools she no longer needed. Every purchase required careful consideration. Traditional log cabin construction used materials readily available in the forest: logs, mud, and moss. Catherine's design demanded additional resources. She needed cordwood in massive quantities, mortar materials, tools for cutting and shaping, and hardware for the roof structure. She began by calculating how much cordwood would be required. Her planned cabin would have a diameter of 20 feet, creating interior space of approximately 314 square feet. The circular wall would measure roughly 63 feet in perimeter, with walls 7 feet high and cordwood pieces 14 inches long, she estimated, needing approximately 540 individual pieces. That assumed minimal waste and tight fitting. Adding 20% for mistakes and irregular pieces brought the total to approximately 650 cordwood rounds. Catherine spent 3 weeks cutting cordwood. She selected standing dead pine and fir, trees that had died naturally and dried while standing. Dead wood was lighter to transport and would not shrink after installation like greenwood would. She cut trees into manageable sections, then sectioned those into 14-inch lengths. Each piece required careful attention. She rejected rounds with excessive taper, large knots, or rot. She wanted uniform diameter, approximately 10 to 12 inches, and reasonably straight grain. The work was brutally hard. Catherine had helped Henrik with various tasks, but had never felled trees or processed timber in quantity. Her hands developed blisters that burst and reformed as calluses. Her back and shoulders ached constantly. She learned to read trees for safety, understanding how they would fall and where the danger lay. She had one close call when a widowmaker, a dead branch hung in the canopy, fell near her while she worked. After that, she moved more cautiously, checking overhead before each cut. She stacked the finished cordwood near her intended building site, organizing pieces by diameter and quality. The pile grew slowly. By mid-June, she had approximately 400 pieces and understood she needed at least 2 more weeks of cutting to reach her target. Neighbors who passed by and saw her work shook their heads. Samuel Patterson stopped one afternoon and watched her split a log into rounds. He asked again if she would reconsider. Building a proper rectangular cabin would require less wood and less labor. Catherine thanked him and continued working. Mortar presented a different challenge. Traditional cabin chinking used mud and moss. materials that dried poorly and cracked extensively. Catherine needed something stronger and more weather-resistant. She remembered Mary's descriptions of earth plaster used on winter lodges, and she recalled her father, in Bohemia, mixing lime and sand for mortar. She experimented with different combinations using clay from the creek bank, sand, water, and small amounts of ash from her fireplace. Her early attempts failed. The mixture either crumbled when dry or remained too soft. She adjusted ratios, testing each batch by forming small samples and allowing them to cure. After 20 experiments, she developed a mixture that hardened well, resisted water, and bonded to wood. The formula used 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part ash, mixed with just enough water to create thick paste. She also added a handful of horsehair from Henrik's deceased horse, cut into short lengths. The hair reinforced the mortar, preventing cracks as it dried. This technique came from watching a stonemason in St. Louis years earlier. Catherine began construction in early July. The first task was creating a foundation, something most frontier cabins lacked entirely. She had observed that cabins built directly on ground often developed problems. Logs in contact with soil rotted quickly, moisture wicked upward into walls. Frost heave in winter shifted structures, opening gaps and stressing joints. Catherine planned to build a proper stone foundation that would elevate her cabin above ground moisture and provide stable support for the heavy cordwood walls. She selected a site on slight elevation 50 yards from the creek, positioning the cabin where drainage would be good and sight lines clear. Using a stake and rope, she marked a perfect circle 20 feet in diameter. Then she began digging. The trench needed to be approximately 18 inches deep and 12 inches wide, following the circular perimeter she had marked. The excavation took 5 days of hard labor. She encountered rocks, roots, and surprisingly hard clay once she passed the topsoil layer. With the trench completed, Catherine began gathering stone. She needed flat rocks suitable for stacking, and she found good sources along the creek where water erosion had created precisely the type of material she required. She hauled stone in a canvas sling, making dozens of trips between creek and cabin site. The work was exhausting. Each stone needed to be selected for size and shape, transported 100 yards uphill, and placed carefully in the growing foundation. She laid stones dry at first without mortar, testing the fit and making adjustments. The circular foundation required stones to follow the curve, which meant selecting pieces that naturally wedged together in arc patterns. She learned to identify which stones would work and which to reject. Her eye for fitting stones improved with practice. By the end of the first week, she had completed approximately 15 feet of foundation perimeter, bringing the stones up flush with ground level. The second week, she continued the foundation above ground, bringing it up an additional 8 inches. This elevated the eventual cabin floor enough to prevent snow accumulation against the base of the walls while not being so high as to require steps. She mixed mortar in small batches, working it between stones carefully. The mortar needed to fill all voids while not being so thick as to separate stones excessively. She learned to butter each stone with mortar on all contact surfaces before placing it, then tap it into position with a wooden mallet. The circular foundation created a solid ring of mortared stone, approximately 20 feet in exterior diameter, 18 inches deep, 8 inches above grade, and 12 inches thick. The top surface was reasonably level, varying no more than 2 inches around the entire perimeter. Catherine had used a water level, a simple tool made from clear tubing filled with water, to check elevation at multiple points. When water levels matched at both ends of the tube, those points were at equal elevation. Standing inside the completed stone circle, Catherine felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The foundation had required 3 weeks of brutal labor, and she had completed it alone. Her hands were covered with cuts and bruises. Her back ached constantly. But the work was solid, level, and would support the weight of the cordwood walls she planned to build. Neighbors who saw the completed foundation remained skeptical. Samuel Patterson commented that she had invested tremendous effort into a foundation for a cabin that likely would not work. Catherine simply nodded and began preparations for the next phase. The actual cordwood wall construction began in late July. Catherine had prepared her materials carefully. 650 cordwood pieces sat stacked near the foundation, organized by size. 50 pounds of clay-based mortar mixture sat in a wooden box, protected from rain. Tools included 2 wooden mallets, a level, a plumb line, string for marking courses, and several flat boards for checking wall alignment. She also had buckets for mixing mortar and water hauled from the creek. She began laying cordwood on the interior edge of the stone foundation. Each piece was positioned vertically with the cut end facing outward. This orientation meant the end grain, the circular growth rings of the tree, formed the exterior and interior wall surface. End grain absorbed less moisture than bark or side grain, an important property for durability. She placed the first cordwood pieces carefully, spacing them approximately 1 inch apart around the interior perimeter of the foundation circle. Once the first course was positioned loosely, Catherine mixed mortar and began filling gaps. She worked mortar between each cordwood piece, packing it firmly into all voids. The mortar filled the 1-inch gaps between pieces and extended from the inner face to the outer face of the wall, creating a continuous bond. She also packed mortar between the cordwood and the stone foundation, ensuring solid connection. The process was slow. Each piece required several handfuls of mortar, and Catherine had to ensure no air pockets remained. The curvature of the wall presented challenges she had anticipated, but still needed to solve through practice. Straight cordwood pieces arranged in a circle naturally created a faceted surface, like a many-sided polygon rather than a smooth curve. To minimize this effect, Catherine adjusted spacing between pieces, placing them slightly closer on the interior arc and slightly farther apart on the exterior arc. She also selected pieces of varying diameter, using thicker pieces where the curve was more pronounced and thinner pieces where the wall was straighter. By the end of the first day, she had completed approximately 1/3 of the first course. The work was even slower than she had anticipated. Each piece needed to be level horizontally and plumb vertically. She checked constantly with her tools, making small adjustments. The mortar required time to set between courses, so she could only build so high before needing to wait. She learned to work in sections, completing one segment while mortar in another section cured. The second course went faster as she refined her technique. She staggered joints, ensuring that vertical gaps between cordwood pieces did not align from one course to the next. This created a stronger wall, similar to how bricklayers staggered bricks. She also developed a rhythm, placing 3 pieces, mortaring them, checking for level and plumb, then moving to the next 3. Within a week, the wall had reached 3 feet high, roughly halfway to her planned 7-foot height. Neighbors continued to visit, drawn by curiosity about the strange circular structure rising from the stone foundation. Most comments remained skeptical. One trapper told Catherine directly that her walls would never support a roof, that the cordwood would shift and collapse under weight. Another suggested the mortar would crack in the first freeze, destroying the wall integrity. Catherine listened politely but continued working. She had calculated loads and understood her design was sound. The wall was thick, 14 inches, providing tremendous strength. The mortar was curing hard as stone. By mid-August, the cordwood walls had reached their full 7-foot height. The circular structure dominated the landscape, visible from a considerable distance. Catherine had worked nearly every daylight hour for 6 weeks, and the physical evidence of her labor stood solid and strange on the Montana hillside. The walls were remarkably thick, 14 inches of cordwood and mortar creating a barrier that seemed more fortress than cabin. The circular shape gave the structure an unusual appearance that drew attention from every passing traveler and neighbor. The community's response intensified as the building progressed. What had been polite skepticism evolved into open mockery. Catherine overheard conversations at the trading post where men referred to her cabin as the round folly and Dvorak's madness. Women spoke in sympathetic whispers about the poor widow who had lost her mind along with her husband. Children from neighboring homesteads sometimes walked to her construction site to stare at the peculiar building, giggling and running away when Catherine acknowledged them. Samuel Patterson visited frequently, ostensibly to check on Catherine's welfare, but clearly fascinated by the unconventional construction. He examined the walls carefully, testing their solidity, checking the mortar, studying how the cordwood pieces fit together. Despite his initial skepticism, he admitted the walls were remarkably strong. He could not push them, could not find loose pieces, could not identify obvious structural flaws. But he remained convinced the roof would be impossible to frame properly and that the circular walls would create unusable interior space. Other criticism was less technical and more personal. A Presbyterian minister who traveled through the valley stopped at Catherine's site and suggested that building such an unusual structure demonstrated dangerous pride and unwillingness to accept traditional wisdom. He implied that Henrik's death might have been divine judgment for some unstated sin, and that Catherine's response showed lack of proper Christian humility. Catherine listened without arguing, thanked him for his concern, and returned to work after he left. The work itself provided satisfaction that counterbalanced the social pressure. Catherine could see her design functioning exactly as she had planned. The circular walls were perfectly plumb, rising straight and true from the stone foundation. The mortar had cured into a substance nearly as hard as the stone foundation itself. She tested sections by striking them with a hammer. The mortar did not crack or crumble. The cordwood pieces remained firmly fixed, showing no movement or looseness. She had incorporated several features during construction that would prove important later. Every third course, she had embedded horizontal iron pins extending inward from the walls. These pins, salvaged from Henrik's trapping equipment and some purchased at considerable expense, would support interior shelving and furniture. She had also created 2 small openings during construction. One would become a door on the south side, and another, smaller opening on the east would become a window. Both openings were framed with heavy timber pieces embedded in the cordwood walls. The most challenging aspect was maintaining the circular curve accurately. Catherine had used a center stake with a rope to check radius constantly, ensuring the interior surface remained equidistant from center at all points. Small deviations accumulated, if not corrected immediately, so she measured obsessively. The result was a nearly perfect circle, varying no more than 3 inches in diameter at any height. Standing inside the completed walls, Catherine felt vindicated despite the mockery. The structure was sound, and nothing anyone said could change that fundamental reality. The roof presented the most complex engineering challenge Catherine faced. A circular building required a conical roof, and creating that structure without previous experience demanded careful planning and improvisation. Traditional rectangular cabins used simple gabled roofs with ridge poles and rafters, proven designs any competent carpenter could execute. Catherine's roof needed to distribute weight evenly around a circular perimeter while supporting significant snow load. She planned to intentionally allow snow accumulation for insulation, which meant engineering for weight most builders tried to avoid. She began by erecting a central pole. This required finding a single straight tree approximately 15 feet long and at least 8 inches in diameter at the base. She located a suitable lodgepole pine 2 miles from her cabin and spent an entire day felling it, trimming branches, and dragging it back using rope and Henrik's horse, which she had kept. The pole needed to be perfectly vertical, which required excavating a hole 3 feet deep at the exact center of her cabin and bracing the pole with stones wedged around its base. From the top of the center pole, radiating rafters would extend downward to the circular wall top. Catherine calculated she needed 24 rafters spaced evenly around the perimeter. Each rafter had to be identical in length and angle to create a symmetrical cone. She cut the rafters from straight pine logs, shaping them into roughly square cross-sections approximately 4 inches thick. Each rafter was 11 feet long, extending from the center pole top to several inches beyond the exterior wall face. Attaching rafters to the center pole required creating a hub joint. Catherine fashioned this by cutting a shallow notch in each rafter end and stacking them around the pole top in overlapping pattern. She secured the joint using iron pins and rawhide lashing, creating a connection that distributed weight from all rafters to the central pole. The work required her to construct scaffolding inside the cabin to reach the pole top safely. She built a platform 8 feet high using timber pieces and worked from this precarious perch. Installing the radiating rafters took 2 weeks. Catherine worked carefully, measuring angles and spacing precisely. Each rafter's lower end rested on the cordwood wall top, supported by a flat stone she had embedded in the final mortar course specifically for this purpose. She secured each rafter to the wall using iron brackets she had commissioned from the blacksmith at the trading post. The brackets were expensive, costing nearly $6 for 24 pieces, but they created connections that would not fail under load. Once all rafters were installed, Catherine added horizontal bracing rings. These were curved pieces that connected rafters at intervals, creating structural stability and preventing the rafters from spreading under snow weight. She cut these pieces by soaking straight timbers in the creek for several days until pliable, then bending them to the required curve and allowing them to dry while held in position. The technique was time-consuming but effective. She installed 3 bracing rings at different heights, creating a rigid framework. Over the rafter framework, Catherine laid split planks. She had spent weeks splitting straight-grained pine into rough boards using a froe and maul. The planks overlapped like shingles, each course covering gaps in the course below. She secured planks to rafters using wooden pegs. Over the planks went birch bark in multiple layers, creating waterproof covering. Finally, she spread a thick layer of sod over the entire roof. The living earth and grass would provide insulation, prevent leaks, and hold snow that would add additional insulation value. With the roof completed in late September, Catherine focused on finishing the interior. The circular space created by her design was both familiar and strange. The roughly 300 square feet of floor area felt larger than equivalent rectangular space because no corners broke the visual continuity. Standing at the center, Catherine could see the entire interior with a single glance. The curved walls seemed to embrace the space rather than confine it, creating a sense of containment without claustrophobia. The fireplace became the heart of the design. Catherine built it directly at the center of the circular floor using stone hauled from the creek. The central location was unconventional by frontier standards. Most cabins placed fireplaces against an exterior wall to simplify chimney construction. Catherine's central fireplace required a freestanding chimney rising through the roof peak, but the advantage was that heat radiated equally in all directions. Every point on the circular wall received approximately equal warmth from the fire. She constructed the fireplace with meticulous care. The base was a circular stone platform 3 feet in diameter, elevated 6 inches above the floor to prevent ground moisture from affecting the fire. The firebox itself was circular, approximately 18 inches in diameter, lined with flat stones that would withstand repeated heating. Above the firebox, she built a stone chimney that narrowed gradually as it rose. The chimney passed through a specially reinforced opening in the roof where rafters had been notched to accommodate it. The floor required significant work. Catherine excavated the interior to a depth of 6 inches below the door threshold, removing loose soil and rocks. She filled this excavation with layers of material designed to insulate and stabilize. The bottom layer was 6 inches of gravel for drainage. Above that, she laid flat stones fitted tightly together. The stone floor was cold but durable and could be covered with furs or woven mats for comfort. The excavation and stone floor had taken 3 weeks of labor, but the result was solid and level. Catherine built a raised sleeping platform against the wall opposite the door. The platform was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, elevated 18 inches above the floor. This height placed it above cold air that settled at floor level while keeping it below the warmest air that rose to the roof peak. She constructed the platform from split planks supported by timber pieces embedded in the cordwood wall and braced to floor. The platform included storage space beneath, accessible from the front. Shelving utilized the iron pins Catherine had embedded during wall construction. She laid planks across these pins, creating shelves at various heights around the interior perimeter. The shelves would hold food supplies, cooking equipment, tools, and other necessities. Though curved walls made furniture placement different from rectangular cabins, but Catherine found advantages. A table placed near the center was accessible from all sides. Storage along the curved wall was actually more efficient than in corners of rectangular rooms where space was often wasted. She built a heavy door using the same technique she had observed on Samuel Patterson's cabin. Thick planks reinforced with cross bracing hung on iron hinges. The door opened inward, and Catherine installed a wooden bar that dropped into brackets, securing it against wind or unwanted entry. The window on the east wall was small, 12 inches square, with a wooden shutter that closed from inside. She covered the window opening with oiled paper that admitted light while blocking wind. The first significant snowfall arrived on November 9, 1853, nearly 18 months after Henrik's death. Catherine had moved into her completed cabin in mid-October, spending the final weeks weatherproofing seams, organizing supplies, and preparing for winter. She had stocked firewood, preserved meat, stored root vegetables, and filled every container with rendered fat for lamp fuel and cooking. As the first flakes began falling late that November afternoon, she sat inside her circular cabin and waited to see if her design would function as she had calculated. The snow fell steadily through the evening and night, accumulating rapidly. By dawn, approximately 14 inches covered the ground and snow continued falling. Catherine maintained a small fire in her central fireplace, using only 4 logs through the entire night. The interior temperature remained comfortable enough that she slept under a single wool blanket rather than the multiple layers she had required in her previous rectangular cabin. She noted this detail carefully, understanding it represented the first real test of her thermal design. The snow accumulated on the conical roof exactly as she had planned. The angle was steep enough that some snow slid off initially, but as accumulation increased, the snow began holding. By the second day, approximately 18 inches of snow covered the roof completely, creating a thick, insulating blanket. Catherine could observe the effect from inside. The roof surface that had shown visible gaps between planks before snow arrived now appeared completely sealed. The snow filled every tiny opening, blocking wind and creating dead airspace that trapped heat. Temperature inside the cabin stabilized remarkably. Catherine conducted measurements using a mercury thermometer she had purchased specifically for this purpose. With exterior temperature at approximately 15 degrees above zero and a small fire burning, the interior temperature held steady at 52 degrees measured at 5 feet from the fireplace. More importantly, temperature variation across the interior space was minimal. She measured 48 degrees near the door, 55 degrees near the fireplace, and 49 degrees against the far wall. The circular design was distributing heat almost exactly as she had theorized. Neighbors noticed immediately. Samuel Patterson stopped by 3 days into the storm, ostensibly checking on Catherine's welfare, but clearly curious about how her unusual cabin was performing. He arrived cold from his 3-mile journey, and Catherine invited him inside. Patterson stood in the center of the cabin for several minutes, looking around with an expression that mixed surprise and reluctant admiration. He commented that her cabin was remarkably warm, warmer than his own, despite being smaller. He examined the central fireplace, noting the minimal fire Catherine maintained. He asked about firewood consumption, and Catherine estimated she was using approximately 6 logs per day, compared to the 16 logs she had burned in her rectangular cabin the previous winter. Patterson walked around the interior, studying the cordwood walls, testing their solidity, examining how the roof joined the walls. He checked for drafts and found none. He looked up at the snow-covered roof, visible through the small gaps where light filtered through, and asked if Catherine was concerned about roof collapse. She explained her engineering calculations, the robust rafter design, the intentional snow retention strategy. Patterson listened skeptically, but could not argue with the evidence before him. The cabin was warm, solid, and performing better than conventional construction. He left shaking his head, still unwilling to fully accept what he had witnessed, but clearly impressed despite his skepticism. January 1854 brought the coldest weather Catherine had experienced in Montana Territory. The temperature dropped steadily through the first week of the month, reaching 30 below zero by January 7th. Then a high-pressure system settled over the region, and the cold intensified dramatically. On the morning of January 10th, Catherine's thermometer registered 45 degrees below zero, the lowest reading she had ever recorded. The cold was profound, dangerous, and absolutely still. No wind moved. The air seemed frozen solid. Catherine maintained her routine inside the circular cabin. She kept a small fire burning continuously, feeding it 4 to 6 logs throughout each day. The interior temperature held between 45 and 55 degrees depending on proximity to the fireplace. She wore 2 layers of wool clothing and felt comfortable. More significantly, she could sleep through the night without tending the fire. The thermal mass of the thick cordwood walls absorbed heat during evening hours when she maintained a larger fire, then radiated that stored heat overnight, preventing dramatic temperature drops. The same extreme cold devastated her neighbors. Samuel Patterson appeared at Catherine's door on January 12th, accompanied by his 2 sons. All 3 men looked exhausted and half-frozen. Despite the short journey from their cabin, Patterson explained their situation tersely. Their cabin could not hold heat in the extreme cold. Despite burning wood constantly, their interior temperature had not risen above freezing in 3 days. Ice formed on interior walls. Water froze in buckets next to the fire. They were burning nearly 30 logs per day and still freezing. Patterson's wife had developed a severe cough from breathing frigid air continuously. They needed shelter until the temperature moderated. Catherine welcomed them without hesitation. Her cabin, designed for 1 person, became crowded with 4 additional occupants, but it remained warm. The Pattersons marveled at the temperature. Samuel admitted openly that he had been wrong about Catherine's design. His sons examined the cordwood walls with newfound respect, asking detailed questions about construction methods. Patterson's wife, Margaret, recovered from her cough within 2 days, simply from breathing warm air and sleeping under adequate cover. The Pattersons stayed 5 days until the extreme cold broke and temperatures returned to merely bitter rather than lethal. During those days, other neighbors stopped by, drawn by news that the circular cabin was keeping people warm when conventional cabins were failing. Catherine allowed visitors inside, explaining her design principles patiently. Some remained skeptical, attributing the cabin's performance to luck or unusually good construction rather than superior design. Others asked specific technical questions, taking mental notes about cordwood placement, mortar recipes, and roof engineering. The most dramatic validation came from a trapper named William Hendricks, who arrived on January 14th, nearly dead from exposure. He had been traveling from his trap lines to the trading post when the extreme cold caught him. His emergency shelter, a simple lean-to with a fire, had been inadequate. He had developed severe frostbite on his fingers and toes. The Pattersons had directed him to Catherine's cabin as the nearest warm shelter. Catherine took him in immediately, providing warm food, a place near the fire, and wool blankets. Hendricks recovered slowly, losing portions of 3 fingers to frostbite, but surviving what would have been fatal exposure. While recuperating, he studied Catherine's cabin obsessively. He measured walls, examined joints, questioned Catherine about every aspect of the design. He told her directly that conventional cabins were death traps in extreme cold, that her circular design was revolutionary, and that he intended to build similar structures at his trapline camps. He was the first person to unconditionally embrace Catherine's innovation without reservation or mockery. His validation, coming from an experienced frontiersman, carried weight that would influence others later. Spring arrived in April 1854, and with warming weather came an unexpected development. Samuel Patterson approached Catherine with a proposal. His wife Margaret had been deeply impressed by the circular cabin's performance during the winter. She had convinced Samuel that they should build a similar structure, not as their primary residence, but as a winter refuge, a place where the family could retreat during extreme cold. Samuel asked if Catherine would advise on the construction in exchange for a share of their spring garden produce. Catherine agreed. The Patterson circular cabin was built in June and July. Samuel and his sons provided the labor, but Catherine supervised, explaining techniques and solving problems as they arose. The Patterson version was slightly larger, 24 feet in diameter, designed to accommodate their family of 5. They followed Catherine's methods closely: stone foundation, cordwood walls, central fireplace, conical roof engineered for snow load. The construction took 3 months, and Samuel admitted freely that the work was more demanding than conventional cabin building. But he had been convinced by winter's harsh demonstration that the extra effort was worthwhile. Word of the second circular cabin spread through the frontier community. Reactions varied. Some settlers remained dismissive, unwilling to abandon rectangular construction regardless of evidence. They cited tradition, ease of building, and aesthetic preferences. One wealthy homesteader from Pennsylvania stated bluntly that he would not live in what appeared to be an indigenous dwelling, that circular cabins looked primitive, regardless of their thermal performance. Catherine understood that some minds would never change, that prejudice and pride mattered more than survival for certain people. But others began reconsidering. A widow named Sarah Whitmore, whose husband had died from pneumonia exacerbated by living in a perpetually cold cabin, asked Catherine for detailed advice. Catherine spent 2 days helping Sarah plan a circular cabin design. Sarah built it that summer with help from neighbors, creating the third circular structure in the region. Trappers working remote territory became particularly interested. The idea of warm shelter using minimal firewood at distant trapline camps appealed to men who understood that hauling or cutting firewood in deep winter was dangerous, exhausting work. By autumn 1854, 5 circular cabins existed within a 50-mile radius of Catherine's original structure. None of the builders claimed they were copying Catherine directly. Most credited the Salish winter lodges or their own innovations. Catherine did not care about recognition. She cared about results, and the results were clear. People who spent winter in circular cabins burned less firewood, maintained warmer interiors, and survived extreme cold more safely than those in rectangular structures. The indigenous communities observed this development with quiet amusement. Mary, the Salish woman who had shown Catherine the winter lodges years earlier, visited in September 1854. She examined Catherine's cabin with approval and made an observation that Catherine found both funny and sad. White people, Mary noted, had finally learned what indigenous peoples had known for generations: But they would never acknowledge the source of their knowledge. They would tell themselves they had discovered these techniques independently. Catherine understood the truth of this statement and felt both grateful for what she had learned and ashamed of her community's unwillingness to credit indigenous wisdom openly. Catherine Dvorak lived in her circular cabin for 23 years. She never remarried, choosing instead to maintain her independence through gardening, raising chickens, and occasional work as a midwife for neighboring families. Her cabin became a landmark in the region, a place travelers used for navigation and a shelter that anyone in need could approach for help during harsh weather. Catherine turned no one away during winter storms, and her small circular home sheltered dozens of people over the years, saving lives that would have been lost to exposure. The technique spread slowly across the northern frontier. By 1860, approximately 15 circular cabins existed in Montana Territory. By 1870, that number had grown to perhaps 50, scattered across remote regions where settlers faced extreme winter conditions. The design never became mainstream. Most homesteaders continued building rectangular cabins, following tradition and resisting innovation. But among trappers, prospectors, and settlers in the most isolated regions, circular cordwood cabins gained acceptance as superior winter shelter. Several documented cases recorded lives saved specifically because people built or reached circular cabins during extreme weather. In winter 1867, a family of 5 survived a blizzard in an abandoned circular trapper's cabin. Without that shelter, they would have frozen. In 1872, 2 prospectors survived a month-long cold snap in a circular mining camp cabin, burning half the firewood they would have needed in rectangular structures. These stories circulated through frontier communities, quietly building the reputation of circular design. Catherine died in October 1876 at age 51. The years of hard labor, limited medical care, and harsh climate took their toll. She was buried next to Henrik on the hillside above her cabin. Her death was noted in the territorial newspaper with a brief obituary that mentioned her as a homesteader and midwife, but said nothing about her contributions to frontier architecture. Her circular cabin remained standing and occupied for decades. A series of homesteaders lived there, each recognizing the structure's superior qualities. The cabin required minimal maintenance. The cordwood walls remained solid. In 1894, a surveyor sketched the cabin and noted it as remarkable circular construction, appears very old but structurally sound. By 1900, the cabin was 50 years old and still habitable, outlasting most rectangular cabins built during the same era. The phrase, "built like a Dvorak round," entered local usage in some communities, though Catherine's name was often forgotten. She had not built her cabin for recognition. She had built it to survive after watching Henrik die in inadequate shelter. The fact that others adopted her methods and survived winters they might not have otherwise was sufficient legacy. A few circular cabins survive into the 21st century, preserved as historical curiosities. These structures represent physical evidence of a moment when one person questioned conventional wisdom and created something that worked better than accepted methods. Catherine Dvorak proved that with careful observation, willingness to learn from multiple sources, and determination to solve problems, one person could create something genuinely better than tradition. Her circular cabin worked exactly as designed. It kept people warm in conditions that killed them in conventional shelters. The impossible had become routine.